You're unwrapping a container of soup your son brought in from 3 states away, and a nurse's hand is already closing around the lid before she's asked what's inside it. She's not reading the label. She's not checking what temperature it was held at, or whether it's homemade or store-bought, or whether the patient in this room even has a food restriction on file. The container is going, and the reason you get is the one families hear in hospitals everywhere: it's the rule, no outside food. What almost nobody tells you is where that rule actually comes from, and it isn't where you'd guess. Hospital food policy just changed again this past March, and it won't be the last shift this year. If you'd rather hear about the next one before it's a nurse at your door enforcing something that changed while you weren't looking, that's exactly what subscribing here gets you, the next one of these, before you need it. Most people picture a health inspector standing behind a rule like this, the same kind of official who checks a restaurant kitchen for hand washing and expired dates. In a lot of states, that inspector has no authority over your soup at all. Florida State Health Department has said outright that it no longer has food regulatory authority in hospitals. That job now sits with the same agency that licenses the hospital itself, not the health inspector you're picturing. Texas splits a single hospital down the middle. The cafeteria and the gift shop counter need a retail food permit because they serve the general public. But the tray that reaches a patient's bed isn't covered by that same permit at all. Iowa goes further and writes patient and staff hospital food out of its retail food licensing law entirely, on the stated grounds that some other state agency already has it covered. 3 states, 3 completely different answers to the same question: who's actually watching this kitchen? And that's before you even reach the other 47. The next part matters more than the last one, because it stops being about who inspects the kitchen and starts being about whether the medical reasoning behind restricting certain patients still holds up the way it did when the rule was first written. For patients going through chemotherapy or a stem cell transplant, that restriction has a specific name: a neutropenic diet, built around avoiding raw produce and anything considered higher risk for carrying bacteria, on the assumption that food itself was the main door pathogens used to reach a badly weakened immune system. That assumption is decades old, and it's the one a lot of families still carry from watching a parent or a spouse go through treatment years ago. It's also the one currently being re-argued with real data in real time. A review pooling 5 separate studies and more than 1,000 transplant and cancer patients found no measurable difference in major infection rates between patients kept on the restrictive diet and patients allowed a standard one, once ordinary food safety handling was already in place. A trial run in one hospital system in Italy went further and found a non-restrictive diet wasn't just as safe for certain transplant patients, it also left them with a better quality of life, in the first study of its kind to test the question head-to-head. And the newest piece, a randomized trial of 1T1 stem cell transplant patients, found almost no gap in daily calories between the 2 diets, 678 versus 724, and no real difference in weight loss during the riskiest stretch of treatment either. Here's where I'd slow down and be honest about what that actually proves, because it isn't the same as saying the old rule was pointless. The safety piece, no measurable rise in infections on a liberalized diet, is now fairly consistent across more than one study. The nutrition piece is weaker. Loosening the diet didn't solve the problem researchers hoped it would, which is patients simply not eating enough during the worst stretch of treatment. So the honest version isn't that the restriction was never necessary. It's that the restriction wasn't doing the specific job everyone assumed it was doing for at least this one group of patients, and the newer research on how infection actually reaches a chemotherapy-damaged gut points somewhere else entirely, through the gut and mouth tissue itself, not through what's sitting on the plate. If the underlying science is genuinely loosening, you'd expect hospital food policy to loosen with it. It isn't. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services put out new guidance this past March, tying hospital menus more tightly to national nutrition policy, pushing hospitals to line up their menus, their purchasing, and their therapeutic diet plans with the newest federal dietary guidelines, specifically calling out ultra-processed food and added sugar. The stated reason has nothing to do with the neutropenic diet debate at all. It's that roughly 90% of the country's healthcare spending now touches patients with a chronic disease, and the agency wants hospital food managed as part of that, not just served alongside it. So 2 tracks are moving in opposite directions at the same moment. The transplant patient science loosening up, and general hospital food policy tightening down for a completely unrelated reason. Neither one is really about your Tupperware, which leaves the actual question underneath all of this. If it isn't a science, and it isn't a federal safety mandate written with your container in mind, what is that nurse's hand actually protecting against when she reaches for the lid? The next fact is the one-court records actually back up, and it runs the opposite direction from what most people expect. When you look at where documented harm shows up, real lawsuits, not hypotheticals, it isn't coming from what families carry in at all. Wrongful death and choking cases in hospital and nursing home settings across several different states keep landing on the same failure point: staff serving a restricted patient, the wrong meal that the facility itself prepared, not a relative bringing something in from outside. The food moving to the kitchen the hospital controls is the one showing up in courtrooms. The food coming through the door in a grocery bag mostly isn't. I'll say plainly what struck me putting this together. A blanket no outside food rule doesn't close that gap at all. It just shifts the conversation onto the one source of food the hospital doesn't have to answer for if something goes wrong. That liability instinct also lines up with something families describe over and over without ever connecting it back to the sign on the door: hospital trays going untouched. Cold, bland, delivered at the wrong hour, sometimes applied as a blanket ward rule, even to a patient with no diet restriction on file at all. People end up bringing in outside food not to defy the hospital, but because they've quietly concluded the hospital's own food service isn't meeting a basic need. The sign stays up regardless, which is part of why it reads to a lot of families as protecting the system's reputation for its own kitchen as much as protecting anyone's health. There's one more piece worth slowing down for, because it's the flip side of everything so far. Outside food does carry its own risk, just not the kind anyone is actually regulating for. A hospital in England dealt with exactly that a few years back, when a visitor brought in a cake as a thank you gift for staff, not realizing it had been made with cannabis. A staff member ate a piece before anyone caught what was in it, and the hospital ended up bringing in police once they figured out what had happened. No patient was affected, and nobody involved meant any harm, which is the whole point of it. That's not a mismatched diet order, and it's not a kitchen error. It's a risk that has nothing to do with jurisdiction, chart orders, or any of the regulatory machinery above, and no amount of signage would have caught it either, since it was never aimed at patients in the first place. So the actual answer braids together three separate things, and none of them is the one families usually assume walking in. Part of it really is liability. A hospital manages the food it fully controls more easily than it manages something it can't inspect or standardize, and the courtroom record backs that instinct up even if nobody at the bedside would put it in those words. Part of it is a set of medical restrictions that, for at least one major group of patients, is being actively re-examined against newer research rather than settled science handed down once and for all. And part of it is a genuine, if rare, category of risk that has nothing to do with either of the first two, the unpredictable kind, not the kind any inspector or any chart order was ever built to catch. None of this changes what's actually written for the specific patient in front of you. If there's a diet order on the chart, that instruction comes from the team looking at that patient, and it's the one to follow regardless of what a general study found across a different group elsewhere. This is general information about where these rules come from, not a reason to second guess what your own doctor or dietitian has already decided for your situation. So the next time a plate gets waved away at the door, there's one question that actually gets you somewhere, instead of just hearing, "It's the rule." Again, ask whether there's a written diet order on file for that specific patient, right now, today. If there isn't one, you're not up against a medical restriction at all. You're up against a policy that exists for reasons that have nothing to do with what's